Miss Lizzie. I don't ever smoke the dizzy, but we can always share some ditties. It's just a cup in time. This song doesn't have to rhyme. Life's all of us, not every moment we can be feeling fine. I wanna share a moment, just a second if you will, maybe even a cup of thrill. We could share this performance. It's tea time, come sit with me.
Well, welcome guys. Miss Liz in the house, that's right. And we have the last tea time of February 2026, and we have Chester L. Richards in the house, and we're going to talk about Star Trek and rockets and adventures. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. But before we get started, you guys know how Miss Liz rolls. Get over to all the platforms: Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, Spotify, YouTube, all of those good platforms. Give that a like, follow, and subscribe, and get these tea times out there. If they do resonate with you, or you do know that someone needs this tea time for an uplifting or just to enjoy an hour of entertainment, send that tea time to them. So let's get started with disclaimer and then a little intro, and then we're going to get Chester in here and we're going to spill some tea together. And today's tea is to be entertaining. Life is an adventure. So that's the tea we are serving tonight in this house. Tea Time live show with Miss Liz. Miss Liz's Tea Time is a global platform dedicating to sharing real life stories, diverse perspectives, and meaningful conversations that inspire awareness, healing, and connection. Miss Liz is going live using StreamYard. Before leaving a comment during the live broadcast, please grant StreamYard permission to see your name at StreamYard.com. Please be advised that all the content brought forward during any Tea Time show is presented in good faith. However, discussions may include opinions, beliefs, and perspectives that do not necessarily represent the views of Miss Liz or the Tea Time platform. Information shared by the guests is based on their own experiences and is perceived to be accurate at the given time of airing. All guests, viewers, and participants are responsible for using their good judgment when considering any action or decision that may relate to these discussions. Some episodes may cover sensitive topics, including but not limited to trauma, abuse, grief, mental health, and other emotionally triggering subjects. Listeners' and viewers' discretion is strongly advised. Tea Time with Miss Liz is an open discussion forum designed to offer insight, inspire awareness, and create connection. It is not a substitute for professional, medical, legal, or therapeutical advice. If you require professional support, please seek assistance from qualified professionals or trusted resources in your area. If you have any questions regarding this disclaimer or the content of this discussion, you are welcome to contact me, aka Miss Liz, directly at my email at bookingmissliz@gmail.com, or check out my link tree at Miss Liz's Tea Time. By choosing to participate in, comment on, or view these live shows, you acknowledge and accept this disclaimer. Your participation is entirely voluntary. Miss Liz welcomes you to join the conversation with an open heart, and if at any time you feel this platform is not right for you, I respect your wishes and decision and welcome you back whenever you're ready. Tea Time with Miss Liz is serving truth and awareness one cup at a time. Well, welcome to Tea Time with Miss Liz, where curiosity fuels conversation and life experience becomes legacy. Today, we welcome a man whose journey reads like an adventure novel, filled with science, creativity, and courage and exploration. Joining us is Chester L. Richards, retired aerospace engineer, prolific inventor with 19 patents, composer, storyteller, and lifelong adventurer. Chester's career spans decades of innovation in space technology, yet his creativity does not stop at engineering. While still in college, he co-authored the iconic Star Trek episode, Star Trek titled The Tholian Web, proving that imagination and science often walks hand in hand. From river rafting in remote locations to surfing, composing music, and contributing to cutting-edge aerospace advancements, Chester's embodies what it means to live a life of boundless curiosity. So grab your cup and lean in. Today's Tea Time is about exploration, not just about space, but of possibilities. Let me get Chester in here and let's spill some tea together. Welcome, Chester.
Well, hi.
It is a pleasure to have you here, Chester.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Chester, who were you as a little guy and who is Chester now?
Oh, uh, I was a little guy who was the same as the guy who's standing in front of you right now, except I didn't know nearly as much as I know now.
So, Chester, what got you into the rocket and science?
Well, I got hooked on science fiction when I was a little kid. I started reading it probably when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And I read pretty much everything that was being published through the golden age of science fiction, which was late 1940s through early 1960s. So that pretty much shaped who I wanted to be, where I wanted to go with my career, and so on. So I studied physics and I studied engineering professionally.
So, how old were you when you got into that field?
Well, I was a teenager when I started college. Yeah, so 17.
So, can you tell us what adventure it was to work with rockets and space and all of that incredible stuff?
Well, I think it's probably more seems like more of an adventure in retrospect than at the time, because at the time you're doing a job with people. You've got assignments that you have to work through. Some of the assignments can be extremely challenging. The fun part, I think, is twofold. Number one, the satisfaction of doing something creative. And secondly, the quality of the people that you're working with. Because the aerospace industry is it's a magnet for the very highest talent in the country. And so I've had the great privilege of working with some of the movers and shakers behind the scenes and people of extraordinary ability. And I've written about a lot of these individuals, the ones that I think really stand out. I've definitely written stories about these people, and they're in the books.
We have a question that just came in. I'm going to pop it up so you can see it, Chester. It's what inspired you to co-write Star Trek episode, the Tholian Web?
Well, that's a bit of a story. It turns out that I had a school friend. Her name was Judy Burns. And she was interested in writing for Star Trek. And I didn't know anything about the show. I was a graduate student at the time. And she sat me down and showed me some videotapes that she had made of various episodes. And so I kind of got the picture in my head. You have to understand, I didn't even own a television set in those days. So I was basically just a graduate student focused on my studies. And so she sat me down and showed me a bunch of these shows and communicated her enthusiasm for the series. This was back in the 1967, 1968 timeframe. The show went off the air after the second season, and Judy was working pretty hard to get the show back on the air, working with other people, and they succeeded in getting the show back on the air. In the meantime, she had decided that she wanted to do some script writing as a way of getting herself involved with the show. So she took a script writing class that I was invited to audit as well. And so I'm in the middle of all of this, and I go to sleep one night, and I have a dream that I'm on the bridge of the Enterprise, of the Starship Enterprise, which is okay. So I'm just watching what's going on with the various Star Trek characters. And suddenly a ghost comes through the wall and starts to haunt the bridge and scares everybody half to death. This is in my dream. Now, I'm just observing. I'm not scared at all. I'm just saying this is a really interesting reaction. So I woke up and I wrote down the essence of the dream, and I went back to sleep. And the next morning I called Judy and I said, you're interested in writing stories. Here's an idea I had from last night while I was dreaming. And she thought the ghost story would be a really good idea. So she asked me to collaborate with her in writing a speculative script for Star Trek. which we did. And through a variety of machinations, primarily with respect to the guy, Bob Duncan, who was running the script writing class, we got in to see the producer of the third season. The producer of third season was Fred Freiberger. And I write about all of this. It's in the first book that I've written. So there's a lot of detail that I'm not covering here. But basically...
Chester, let me pop up that book so you can talk a little bit about the book.
Sure. Okay, so this is the first book of a trilogy. 2 books have been published now, and the third book is written, but it still needs editing, and it'll come out in a year or so. And basically what these are a series of pretty much independent stories. You can start the book any place in the middle and work your way towards the ends. Because the stories are all independent, but they cover various adventures that I've had during the course of a long lifetime. Some outdoor adventures, some professional adventures, some tragedies, some triumphs, generally things that are intended to entertain people. So the first of these major stories in the book, of course, is the one about Star Trek and how I got involved. So there's the details that I can't cover in this short period are covered in that first story. So to resume, basically, Judy and I went up for a producers conference, and they told us, "Hey, we like your story. We're gonna buy your script." And so that was a great thrill. But then, of course, there's always a little catch. And the catch was, well, there's some minor revisions that we require. And listening to the minor revisions, we realized that they had just trashed everything. We had to write a completely new story. But then they stuck the knife in and twisted it because they said they gave us a week. The meeting was on a Friday. They gave us until next Friday to produce a revised story and script.
Wow.
And so we had to basically we were able to preserve some of the elements of the original story, but basically we had to write a whole new story and then write a script on top of that story treatment, which we did. So we were really busy driving back home. Both of us were living in Orange County at the time. So on the long trip back home, we started blocking out a new story. And then we worked until after midnight. And a lot of the major elements of the new story came into place during that long evening. The Tholians got invented, the web got invented. And so when we finally dragged ourselves off to bed that night, we had pretty much a good story treatment on where we were going to go for the next week. And we had pretty much blocked out most of the scenes that we had to write for the next week as well. But it was a real struggle. And I have to tell you, I was typing the last page on the revisions Friday morning when the sun came up over the horizon. I mean, and I drove over to Judy's house, and we got in the car and toddled our way up to Paramount Studios for a first 8 o'clock in the morning meeting at Paramount. Wow. So we had to get up there really early to beat the traffic and everything. But we made it, and we were able to talk our way past the guard. People at Star Trek hadn't put our name at the gate. So we had to talk our way past the guard to get into the Paramount Studios. But they liked the revisions. They liked the new story. They really did like it a lot. And I have to say it was a lot better. The suggestions that had been made really made for a story with a much greater impact than the first version that we had produced. So then things go into production. Of course, there's modifications during the final write-up period and things of that sort that have to be incorporated. So there still was 2 or 3 more months of pretty hard work in making adjustments. But basically, At some point, we just walked away because our job was done, and they took the production from there.
Well, I think Star Trek has been one of the shows that many of us listened to when we were younger, or heard about. When I first was reading, when Shirley sent me your books and that, I was just like, oh my goodness, Star Trek. I remember watching that with my dad.
Yeah.
So we have some questions that are coming into the studio, and I just want to pop them up. Something
Sure.
about your patents. You have 19 patents. I guess would like to know which of your 19 patents are you most proud of?
Well, I don't know that. Well, obviously my latest, which is my 20th patent, which was just filed, and was just issued by the patent office. So I've now got 20 official patents, and obviously the latest is your favorite. But I think probably the most significant invention that I've had, and I haven't patented most of my inventions. The patents are expensive. People don't want to spend the money unless they absolutely have to. So probably the most important invention that I've created is a way of visually using cameras to track with extremely high precision, track targets with extremely high precision. When I was given when I was given the assignment, which was back in the mid 1970s, this had to do with increasing the precision of tracking for laser weapons, as it turns out. That was its first application, but it's had many applications since then. But the tracking techniques that were available at the time were simply not accurate enough to make laser weapons work. And so the requirement was to improve the tracking precision by a factor of 100. And nobody thought that could be done. But I figured out a way of doing that increase in precision. And in fact, we could and ultimately increase the precision of tracking by a factor of 1,000. And
Wow.
That was a major breakthrough in technology. And it's been just the idea that you can do such a thing has had profound influence across all kinds of things. The space telescopes, for example, wouldn't be possible without that kind of tracking accuracy. So, and I'm the guy who started that. So that's the thing I'm most proud of, I think.
Another question that came in is, how did your real life space tech work influence your storytelling?
It's the people that I worked with. These are fascinating people. I mean, I'll tell you a story about one of the guys that I think is probably most relevant to most people. His name was Tom Coltis, and he is one of the great American heroes. And let me tell you a little bit about his story. So he was a guy who was an expert in rocket engine development. And in fact, for a long time, he was the #1 rocket engine designer in the United States. And he was in charge of the most critical portions of the rocket engines on the Saturn rocket, the big F1 engines. He was in charge of the thrust chambers and all the thermal control and everything for that engine, which is a remarkably important job to have. I think he was probably about 30 years old when he got that job, something like that. But that's not where his real fame is, or where his real accomplishment was. If you take a look at the history of the Saturn rocket that took us to the moon, it turns out there were a number of test flights, and of each test flight, of course, was stressing the rocket to a greater extent than the previous test flights. When they got to the 16th test flight, this was to be the last of the unmanned test flights. Flight 17 was the one that was going to have the astronauts. But Flight 16, they had finally put the full weight loads on the rocket, on the rocket itself. Up until that time, they've been flying the rockets with less than full weights. What they found out during the 16th flight is there was a kind of a vibration called a Pogo oscillation that was so severe that it would have killed the astronauts, and it killed the program. They couldn't fly Apollo 17 because the astronauts would not survive the experience. So the program was dead. This was 1968, I think it was. Well, Tom Coltis looked at the problem, and he had enough experience and enough creativity to figure out what the real problem was. So he made some major design changes in the first stage of the Apollo Saturn V launch vehicle, and they incorporated the changes that he proposed. And so the tests were, ground tests were successful, and they did fly 17, and the astronauts did get to the moon, but they wouldn't have gotten to the moon without Tom Coltis. He's a real American hero. Now, Tom, I worked alongside Tom for 4 years, literally sitting next to him, sitting at his desk. And after I left the company, he continued to coach me through design of a jet engine that I have a patent on. So Tom was one of my gurus, basically. And it was a great privilege to be taught one-on-one by the best rocket engine designer in the world. But that's the kind of people that I've run into, and there have been several others. But that's a really fascinating story as far as I'm concerned, because he's a real American hero.
And these are people that we don't hear about in everyday conversations. And that's why I like having guests like you on here, Chester, because we can hear about these heroes. And this is what Teatime is all about, is getting those voices out there, getting their stories out there as well. And having you as a guest, you're getting his story out here to my listeners as well. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So we have a question. It's, what was your favorite invention?
Well, I think I just answered that question. Yeah, no, I've had a lot of inventions. Most of the inventions are minor. You have a task, nobody knows how to solve a certain problem. You solve the problem, and that invention comes out of that. And maybe somebody decides, somebody you're working with decides to pay the bill and actually patent the invention. But that, if they're doing that to protect themselves and their own business interests. And, and I'll walk away from that. One of the things that I will say about invention, I've had so many, I have no idea how many they are now, but it's got to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 or more.
Wow.
But what's happened with a lot of my inventions is they've just become part of the common culture. Nobody remembers where these ideas came from. I'm the only one who knows where the ideas came from because they came from me. But I've just contributed a lot in the general atmosphere of the technical culture that we live in here.
And that's why you're on my platform, so you can get some of those things out there so people can know that you created them and invented them.
Well, yeah, as I say, I'm not going to take a whole lot of credit for a lot of it. I can take credit in detail if you want to go into the details, but that's kind of silly because I'm working. When I'm doing my job, I'm using other people's inventions, and I have no idea where those inventions came from. It's just part of the technical culture that I work in. But
well, Chester, I'm going to pull up.
There's a lot of creativity out there, and I make use of other people's creativity.
We just had a question come in, and then I'm going to pull up book 2 so we can talk about book 2, because that was the book that I really wanted to talk to you about tonight.
Sure.
What advice would you give young engineers watching live?
Enjoy your work. Don't become a rivet designer. What I call a rivet designer. In other words, don't do this stuff that's just repetitive. Always take the risk of challenging problems that you really don't. Going in, you really don't know how to solve. That's what makes for a very satisfying career.
Well, let's pull up book 2 and talk about book 2. And how do you get the covers of book 2?
Well, I leave it to professionals to figure out what the cover should look like. So yeah, the covers have been designed by professionals. I work with an editor who's also a publisher. She runs a one-man shop, but she works through other people as well. and her name is Ina Hillebrandt, a little hard to pronounce, but she's been very successful in putting together a number of books, not just for myself, but for a number of other people as well. But she works with professional artists in designing the book covers, and it's basically her judgment as to what's a good design and what's not. So I just leave it to her, and of course, I do the final review, but I've been so pleased with the covers so far, so I haven't really done any interference at all.
So Chester, what can we find in this book?
I'm sorry, was that?
What can we find in this book? Because I see with a kitty, I see a rocket, I see an alligator. So is there some kind of comedy in the book?
All right. Well, there's a lot of comedy in the book, and I try and write the stories with a light touch. Not every story is a light touch, both in the first book and also in the second. For example, the young lady up in the corner there is my wife, Sarah. Unfortunately, she passed away 20 years ago now, this May. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary. And that absolutely devastated me when she passed away. We'd been married a long time. And it threw me into the deepest depression, deepest despair. And what I found was in writing things down, writing, for example, the memorial for her mass, for her funeral service, that lifted my spirits a little bit. And I took a cue from that and decided to write stories that she was familiar with. And so I just continued writing stories. And every story I wrote was basically a letter to her. And every story I wrote lifted me one step further towards recovery. And when I got through with that, I found I had a lot of stories. Eventually got back to something close to a normal life. And I just kept on writing because it turned out I was enjoying the process of writing. I guess her spirit was with me the whole time. And so that I talk about that in the first book. And I talk about Sarah and my life with her in the second book as well, because she was a very, very interesting lady, very, very talented. She sang with the Seattle Opera. She was an opera singer, professional singer. She was a licensed psychotherapist who had quite a substantial impact on the local community here. She had 3 master's degrees in different subjects, by the way, so she was well educated. And she was also adopted into the Nez Perce tribe as a adopted Indian. So I actually am married. You see from the picture that she's a strawberry blonde, but I married a strawberry blonde American Indian, if you can figure that, by adoption, of course. No, she was an anthropology student, an anthropology major. And so she was doing anthropology work with the tribe up in Idaho. And the tribal shaman, a lady named Ella, basically taught her the art of being a shaman in the tribe, and Ella apparently adopted Sarah into the tribe as her daughter.
So how did you meet Sarah?
We met at a party, and we got to giggling together. And when you giggle, right? When you giggle together about something or other, obviously there's a bond that forms at that point, and so I think we knew almost instantly. We actually met at a couple of different parties, completely separate parties, as it turned out. But the bond was there, and we knew it right almost from the beginning.
We have a question that came in for you, Chester, and was there a defining moment that changed your career path?
Yeah, I think there was. Back in the 1970s, I was working for a division of Ford Motor Company. And the boss that had hired me and who became a very, very dear friend of mine for the rest of his life. He went to take a position at another company, and we got another supervisor to take his place. And the new guy was really a bad supervisor. And I finally said, the heck with this, I'm not going to continue working at this place any longer. And I went out as a freelance engineer, going from job to job and earning my living as a freelance, which turned out to be a remarkably important thing to do, because what it allowed me to do was to bounce around the industry and get on the inside at many, many different companies and get to understand the industry in a way that most people never get to understand. And I got to work on a remarkable variety of projects as a result of being a freelance. Eventually, I settled down. I got a couple of good jobs, but the final job I got was a job offer you just couldn't refuse. And I ended up finishing my career as an engineering fellow at Raytheon Corporation. As an engineering fellow, you're pretty free to do what you want. You're above the glass ceiling at that point. And so I had a lot of freedom, and I had the opportunity to work again with some of the really extraordinary people that work in that company.
Well, Chester, I'm going to take you on a little adventure. You had an encounter with a leopard.
Yeah. Well,
what did that teach you?
It was a very brief encounter, and it was a very friendly one. Actually, all I did was I said hello to the creature. But the story is that I was on an expedition in Africa, in the country of Ethiopia. There's a river. Used to be a wild river. It's been dammed, unfortunately, since that time. But in those days, it was a wild river, very much like the Colorado River. And I went through a canyon that was very similar to the Grand Canyon. And so we were intending to go down this river on the second expedition that had ever been in that part of the world. This is an area that was completely uninhabited by the locals. So it was just wild animals and a few travelers that had been through there on the previous expedition, and that's it. But we did a get acquainted expedition in a different part of Ethiopia, down in the Afar Triangle, which is in the upper eastern corner of the country. And there's a little river called the Awash River. People that are into anthropology and archaeology will recognize the name. That's where the hominid we now call Lucy was discovered. She was discovered at an embankment of the Awash River. So we were going to go down spend a couple of days going down the Awash River. And at our first campsite there was a little kind of a guardhouse, because this was supposedly a national park. It was completely undeveloped in those days. Nowadays, there's a big resort hotel at this location, but in those days, it was just wilderness. But at this little building, there was a cage, and in the cage was a leopard. And the leopard looked so lonely, I sat down and started talking to the leopard. And the leopard responded like a kitten that it was. Now, this was an adult leopard, but the leopard started to purr and started to scratch against the bars of the cage. Now, you have to understand the bars of the cage were that wide. So I could poke his head through a little ways, and I could easily reach in and pet him. But I figured, it's as much as it's a temptation to pet the leopard, I decided not to do it. I had a responsibility to the other people on the expedition not to get myself in the hospital. So I just sat and chatted with this guy. We talked for probably about an hour, and he purred, and I talked, and he purred, and I think I gave him a little bit of comfort. But that was my encounter with a leopard. And I realized that these cats are just like kitty cats anywhere.
Right. They just need that moment of love.
They just need that moment of they bond with human beings, believe it or not. They really,
Yeah.
they're capable of doing that.
Well, Chester, you said that you once said your life felt like straight out of Star Trek. What did you mean by that?
Well, when I was a kid, I read science fiction, and then I spent my professional career being in science fiction, real life science fiction, but it wasn't fiction; it was the real life. Well, it's like today, you know. I mean, this is 2026. When I was reading those stories, I was a kid, and that was in the 1950s. 2026 is the far distant future. You know, and here I am in the far distant future talking to far distant future people like yourself. You know? and I got to this far distant future place by doing far distant future things along the way, you know.
So the stories that you wrote in Star Trek when you were writing the screenplay in that, do you believe that some of those things have happened in the future?
The future will be different than what people write about. We don't know what the future is going to be like. But obviously, we're living in a universe with physical constraints, and one of the benefits of science fiction is you can eliminate those physical constraints. You can postulate things like faster than light travel, for example, which, you know, somebody in the future, somebody may discover how to do that, but we don't know how to do that now. And so we can't even speculate more than writing stories about it. We really don't understand any physics that will take us there. But one of the insights that I had in reading a lot of stuff is that it suddenly occurred to me that a lot of the science fiction stories that I was reading were just pieces of real human history that have been transported into an exotic setting. You know, the writers that were writing this stuff, most of them were in their 20s and 30s. And they got their ideas by reading history and picking ideas out from things that happened in the history, and setting them in far distant futures and, you know, exotic places and with exotic transportation and so on and so forth. But I mean, there's stories about sea pirates, and there's stories about wars and knights in shining armor, and you know, and incredible geniuses like, you know, like Archimedes, for example. They've changed the names, and they've taken the sea pirates and they've made them pirates in outer space and things of that sort, you know. But basically, they're taken from human history. And once I came to that realization, I realized that I got a huge education by reading all this stuff when I was a kid. You know, I really got a first-class education, but it was in disguised form. It wasn't in the pure form that you get in college.
So you've worked in the science fields for over 50 years, correct, Chester?
Yes, that's right.
So what has surprised you the most over the years?
I think probably the internet. It was and wasn't a surprise. One of the great geniuses that I've had a privilege of working with was a guy named Bill O'Neill, and I can tell you a lot of stories about the contributions that he made to the world culture, and they're really, really major contributions. But Bill and I became very good friends when he first hired me. In fact, the job interview lasted about 5 minutes, and then I was found myself working for this guy, and we worked together for about a decade, something longer than a decade actually, and then we remained extremely good friends all the way until he finally passed away 3 or 4 years ago. When Bill and I were looking at where things were going, I think it was probably around 76 or 77, something like that. What we did was we sat down one day and we mapped out conceptually what the world would look like in the year 2000 and subsequently. And we hit it absolutely dead on the money. This was an age where there were some experiments with personal computers, but they were very primitive. We knew about DARPANET, the internet experiments that were done, sponsored by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. We knew a little bit about what was going on with the new accelerator that was being developed in Europe, the particle accelerator. So we had that as those elements as a foundation. And basically what we did was we figured out where the internet was going to go and where personal computers were going to go. And I had already had the experience with a word processor, because what we did in writing that script for Star Trek, the final version of the script that had to get out, I was typing with the university's single word processor. This was in 1968. The word processor had a computer that was a vacuum tube computer, and the interface was a Selectric typewriter. So I already knew what a word processor was all about. So I could guess where things were going to go in terms of people's interactions with computers in the future. And we pretty much mapped out what the future was going to be. But of course, what we didn't understand was how explosive the growth of the internet and personal computers was actually going to be. That, I think, caught both of us by surprise. The internet is really a world changer. This is a completely different historical period now, because if I need information, I just go to the internet and it's there. I just ask.
Chester, we have some young viewers watching. What message would you have for them to get into the engineering and the aerospace and those departments? How would they go about that?
Or just follow your dream. Read a lot of science fiction. That'll get you hooked. And read a lot of old science fiction. There was a golden age, and the golden age, which probably started in the late 1930s and it continued to mid 1960s. That was a period where science fiction stories were optimistic, where they were forward looking. What happened in the late 1960s and continuing through the 1970s, well, a lot of stories that were very negative were being written. And I would recommend, you will read those stories, but recognize that they're downers. And that's not where you want to go in the future. The future is an optimistic place. And go back and read some of the early stuff, because it was a lot more fun to read, actually. And it was very uplifting, and it really charged you into wanting to create the future. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you, Chester. We have here, why did you choose to write openly about failure in your second book?
I didn't choose to write. I got beat up by my publisher. You got to write this.
Get a publisher.
It's a literally true story. I didn't want to write that. What I'm talking about in the failure, there's really 3 chapters there. And it had to do with my experience as a graduate student. I got all the way to the point where I was giving my dissertation interview with the committee, with the dissertation committee. So I was right at the final part of my graduate studies. And I realized that I had made a mistake in writing the dissertation, and I had to bail out. And I decided, rather than continue another year in school, I was out of money, and I decided to go get a job. It turned out that was a very, very good decision, because then I got to work for Bill O'Neill, as I mentioned, and Bill O'Neill established my career for the rest of the many decades that followed. But basically, what I discovered is the following. To set this up, I got a bachelor's degree in physics. I went to UC Berkeley and got a bachelor's in physics. And I worked for 2 years after I got my bachelor's degree at a company called Hycon. And I had been hired into that company to work into a group of professional inventors. As I write about it in the story, the company had set up a group of professional inventors, kind of as a hobby for the owner of the company. Trevor Gardner was the owner. And I was lucky to get hired into that group, and I got trained as a professional inventor. So it's a little bit, I guess probably the analogy is if you go back to the Renaissance of Florence, and they had these bodegas with famous artists that were running the bodegas. And they cranked out students like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and some other fairly notable artists. So what I was involved with in that particular group of inventors was basically a modern version of a Florentine bodega, where I was trained as a young inventor. And it was a real stroke of luck that happened. So after 2 years, I had declared my intention to go back to graduate school. And everybody said, bless you, that's a good idea. Go do it. You've made a lot of money while working here. Go become a student. So that's what I did. And there's a story about how that happened. I ran into a piece of luck getting into the university. What I discovered when I got into the university as a graduate student is I was ruined as a student, because as an engineer, I had had a great deal of success in inventing things and running groups of engineers and so on. And when I got in graduate school, I thought graduate school was going to be an extension of what I had been experiencing as a professional engineer. What I didn't realize is that graduate school is a political organization, and a graduate student is not expected to participate in the politics. He's expected to keep quiet and stay in the corner and do what he's told. And I didn't do that. And I got into some real trouble, both in the physics department, and later I switched over to engineering, which was a little better, but I still had issues there. So I've written these stories about my experience in being in the physics department and the struggles that I had there. And then moving over to the engineering school, which was a really good thing that I did that, because what I learned in the School of Engineering served me extremely well in the years that followed after I left school. But when I failed my PhD thesis exam, it's not the qualifying exam, but the dissertation review, I bailed out at that point and went to work in industry. And I think that was probably, next to marrying my dear Sarah, that was probably the best thing I ever did in my life, was deciding to walk away from school. The problem is I didn't fit in school at all. And the reason is that school is not structured for professional inventors. It's not structured for people who have the inventive talent and the skills. It's structured for people who are specialists. And I'm the furthest you will find from being a specialist. And it would have been a dreadful experience for me to continue and become a specialist within the academic environment. So it was a piece of luck that things happened the way they did. But writing about it was difficult, because you're talking about, well, we all fail in life. I mean, one of the things an engineer discovers early on is he never gets the thing right the first time. You master something that you've done in engineering by fixing the mistakes, by diagnosing the problems and fixing them. That's how engineered products evolve. They don't come from the brow of Zeus. They fully formed. They come through a process of evolution and fixing problems. So really, my experience in graduate school was a miniature version of what I later experienced as a professional, which was you fail most of the things that you start. And then you figure out through a diagnostic process what went wrong and how you fix what went wrong. And you eventually get something that is actually working pretty well.
So do you like to take things apart and put them back together, Chester?
Yeah, I like to do that conceptually. I do that in my head. One of the things I really enjoyed about both graduate school in physics and engineering is the labs, because I was able to work in the low temperature lab in physics, which was a great experience, and I've written about that. And then in the engineering school, I both took lab courses, and then I was a TA of a lab course as well. And so I did get my fingers dirty doing that kind of stuff. And I've done a certain amount of that since. But most of the work I've done professionally has been analytic in nature. It's been pushing equations around of one sort or another.
Well, just we have another question here for you. It's how do science and creativity complement each other?
Compliment? Yeah.
Complement each other.
Yeah, right.
Say that 3 times fast, Miss Liz.
I guess the best way to explain that is science science isn't one big thing. I mean, it's a whole bunch of different things. It's a process of how you investigate and learn new things and so on. So there's a process, and there's also a store of discovery that's already been made. Science as a whole is extremely rich. And by exploring all elements of science, my background is physics and engineering, but I've spent a great deal of time looking at biology. For example, the thesis that I wrote in graduate school was a thesis in psychobiology, not in engineering. And what I was doing was I was looking at some problems in psychobiology from an engineering perspective. And so my background is professionally is also in biology as well, psychology and biology. And I've gotten inspiration by looking at how people in other parts of science than my professional part, how people have actually approached problems and how they've solved them and what they've discovered along the way. And there's stuff that's absolutely fascinating. I'm learning a little bit about molecular biology at this point, and there are some puzzles in there that are really extraordinary. There's stuff in there that you really have to dig into to understand just how strange this world is that we live in.
So, Chester, is science fiction or real life adventure harder?
Well, the advantage of reading science fiction is you come out of it alive.
In real life, you're gone. You're done.
In real life, there are real risks. And I've taken some of those risks, and I've written about some of the things I've encountered along the way.
So, Chester, what is one of your greatest adventures that sticks in your mind?
Well, getting married, of course. Goodness.
For all my listeners out there, marriage is an adventure.
Yeah, let me approach that. I discovered or realized some time ago. Somebody asked the question, "What's an adventure?" And I had to think about that for a second. Adventure is anything you do that's brand new. Anything that you've never done before is an adventure. Getting a new job, getting married, having a child for the first time, but in successive children as well. Going to a new school, meeting new people, all of these are adventures because there's something in that particular circumstance. You've never done that particular thing before. And you've taken a risk in everything that you've done. When you take on a new job, you don't know if you're going to be successful at that job or not. You don't know how you're going to deal with the people that are involved in that position because they're established and you're not. So you're taking risks when you go into a new job, and that's an adventure. Anytime you do something that's really novel, you're guaranteed to take a risk in doing it, and you have to accept the fact that that's an adventure. That the risk is worth taking, or you wouldn't do it. But you don't know how it's going to come out.
So, Chester, what's the best advice you ignored?
Best advice I ignored. That's a hard one because I don't normally think about that. I really would have to think. I'm sure there are many examples of things that I've ignored that I should have done otherwise. Probably when I had what I thought was going to turn into a romantic relationship and I walked away from it. My life would have been totally different if I had gone in the other direction. But that's an advice I gave to myself, and it was the wrong advice.
And you gave it to yourself and you didn't listen to it, did you?
Yeah.
Well, that's the best advice when we don't listen to ourselves, right?
Right.
But Chester, if anybody would like to get your books or to have you on their podcast or anything like that, where could they reach you?
Well, they can get my books at Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And if you do read the books, please write a review. I've been very fortunate that I've gotten reviews primarily for my first book. I've gotten reviews for the second book, but they're not showing up on Amazon at this point. And I've been very fortunate that the reviews have always been very good, very positive. But I would be really interested to read negative reviews. I would like to find out what I did that stepped on somebody's toes. So please, if you read those stories and you don't like them, write a bad review. I'd like to read those. But if you want to write a good review, I'm more than welcoming a good review. But please, the stories are written to be enjoyed. You know, what you'll find is a lot of the stories are very entertaining. I've written about. Well, I'll give you an example of one of the stories that I wrote, which I think is a really interesting story. So when I was a physics student, I worked in the low temperature physics lab, and the professor in that lab was a guy named Johnny Pelham. And Johnny Pelham was a world famous experimental physicist. I mean, he was really top of the line experimentalist. So he was one of my early gurus, and I worked in his lab for a year. But I had no idea what his real background was until he started to tell me the stories. When he was a graduate student, half-time at MIT and half-time at Harvard. And this was during World War II, and he was involved with some research for the Navy that was taking place at both of those universities. So he was already known as an expert in acoustics, and the Navy was with sonar and all the rest were very interested in acoustics. And he got tapped to go to England in the middle of World War II. And they didn't tell him what he was going to England to do, but it turned out, and there's a lot behind this story, and I won't go into the details, but he ended up being being in charge of a submarine in the British Navy. And he did some work as a submarine skipper. This is a graduate student, by the way, straight out of school, being put in charge of a submarine. And he ended up being in charge of a flotilla of warships, as it turned out. And the work that he did won a presidential citation from President Roosevelt. So I've written that story, and it's a cracking good sea story about a guy I used to work for who told me this story, and I just wrote it down.
And that's what it is, right? We have to share those stories and get those legends out there, because the people that you've mentioned tonight on tonight's Tea Time, Chester, are people that we don't know about, people that we've never heard of. Some of my listeners are just hearing their names for the first time. Go out and check and do the research on these incredible people. This is what I like doing with Tea Time, is I like getting those stories out there, getting people that we may not have known about had it not been for Chester coming and sitting and having tea with Miss Liz. So,
well, yeah, and the only person who's really written these guys up is me. You know, I've basically written a little bit of their biographies, not a whole lot, but a little bit, just to give you an acquaintance with who these incredible people were. One of the people that I wrote about in the first book is a guy named Bob Pons. And he was my guru for a while. I basically learned system architecture from Bob Pons. Bob Pons was one of these, well, let me put it this way. He got his bachelor's degree from Caltech when he was 17 years old.
wow.
So, and he went to work for General Motors. By the time he was 30, he was the chief engineer of the Cadillac engine division of General Motors. He was in charge of all of the design and production of engines for all the General Motors cars and trucks.
Wow.
And he was probably about 31 or 32 years old at the time. He left General Motors for reasons that I write about in the book, went to work for Henry Ford. And the result of that was that Henry put him on a project that took him to Newport Beach, where I was working at the aeronutronic division of Ford Motor Company. And that's how I got to meet Bob Pons. Is he had taken his design team from Dearborn and moved them to Newport Beach. So that was because he didn't like the environment in Dearborn. It was just too stuffy. So with his design team in Newport Beach, he did the engines. If you've seen the movie Ford versus Ferrari.
Oh, yes, I did. I did see that movie. I'm a car junkie, so.
Yeah, Carroll Shelby had a car that had an engine, and that engine absolutely refused to quit when they ran it in the race, and they overdrove the engine, and the Ferrari engines were quitting, and the Carroll Shelby engine refused to quit. Well, that wasn't a Carroll, but that was Carroll Shelby's engine in that he was using it. But Bob Pons was the guy who designed that engine. And that was the project that Henry had put him into Newport Beach to do. Basically, what Henry Ford asked Bob to do was design an engine that would win every race in the world. And that's what Bob did. He designed an engine, probably more than one engine, that literally won every race in the world. And after that, Henry Ford called him up and said, "Come back to Dearborn." And Bob Pons says, "No, I don't." He says, "I like it at Newport Beach." He says, "I think I'll stay." This is a true story. So Henry Ford said, "Okay, fine, you're fired." So Bob Pons walked across the street to the administration building and got the job as an aerospace engineer. And that's how I got to meet him.
So Chester, what's your favorite car?
The one I'm driving, because it gets me from here to there.
But if you could have a dream car, what would your dream car be, Chester?
Well, I had a car. I had an Acura Integra, which they don't make anymore. And that was a sports car. And that really was a wonderful car to have and drive. Unfortunately, it didn't survive a collision. There was a guy running drugs who collided with that car. He was fleeing from He was fleeing from a drug bust. Can't get the words out. And I had a head-on collision with him, and it demolished my beautiful car. But they caught him, by the way. They caught the guy later on because his car was wrecked as well. And through the repair shops, they were able to locate the guy and arrest him and put him in jail. But my poor Integra didn't survive the experience.
I'm a car junkie. I like the old style, the old details in the cars, the weight of the cars. I find these plastic cars that they make and now they're like, you blow them away like a kite.
Yeah, well, that happened. There, if you go on my Twitter site, one of the things I do post on the Twitter site are photographs that I've taken over the years, but I also kind of ransack the YouTubes that are out there. There's a lot of very interesting YouTubes out. And when I find a YouTube that I think is going to be interesting to the community, I post that on my website, on my Twitter site. And you will find one of the postings, a discussion of the automobile in the 1970s and where it went wrong. So I recommend that you check that one out because I was working for Ford Motor Company at the time. And that analysis of what happened in the 70s is absolutely dead on. It smacks the bullseye of the target. There's a lot that happened during that period that was very negative. And what the person in the YouTube is pointing out is that basically what happened at all of the American automobile companies is that the accountants took over from the engineers. They pushed the engineers aside. And so you got a period of something over a decade where the American automobiles were really pretty junky. And that was when the Japanese and the Koreans moved in and with high quality vehicles. Now, American vehicles are back in being good, well-engineered vehicles, but there was a lot of damage done during that period. I will tell you, as an employee of Ford, as an engineering employee of Ford, none of my fellow engineers would buy Ford cars.
Wow. So, Chester, what final message do you have for all the listeners tonight?
What kind of message? I'm sorry, I missed that.
The final message. Oh,
final message. Don't be afraid of adventure. Don't be afraid of doing something new. You're going to take some hard knocks along the way. You might even, if you do crazy things that I've done, you might even get yourself killed, but at least you'll have fun doing it. So, and there is a reasonable chance that you'll survive the experience. And when you do, you will be a hell of a lot richer from having experienced these things than if you hadn't taken the risk and done them.
Well, Chester, thank you so much for sitting and having tea with me tonight and sharing your stories with my listeners out there. I want to thank all the new listeners that have tuned in tonight and joined in and brought your questions. Thank you for that and bringing topic to the conversation tonight. I'm just going to do a wrap up of what tonight's tea time was, and then we'll wrap it up and we'll be back in March for the first tea time. What an inspiring and expansive conversation. Chester, thank you for reminding us that curiosity is not something we outgrow. It is something we cultivate. Your life proves that intellect and imagination are not separate paths, but partners in innovation. Tonight, we learned that adventure does not belong to youth alone. It belongs to anyone willing to keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep creating. Whether through engineering, music, storytelling, or travel, you've shown us that life is richest when we refuse to stay small. To everyone watching, may you leave this tea time daring to explore your own frontiers, personal, creative, or professional. The universe is vast, but so is your potential. Until we gather again, keep your curiosity alive and your cup open to wonder. And I'll see you guys March 4th for the first tea time of March.